Everyone faces trials in life that leave an indelible mark on their soul. Not all emotional pain erupts in a cry of despair. Sometimes it lies dormant deep within the heart, transforming into silence or, conversely, into an inexhaustible source of inner strength. Some people who have experienced difficult times learn to skillfully conceal their true feelings, wearing a mask of well-being simply to avoid burdening others with their problems. However, behind the outward restraint, seeming coldness and emphasized independence, lies a whole history of endured suffering. As the renowned psychologist Carl Jung warned, unspoken and misunderstood pain tends to go into the shadows, manifesting in a person's behavior. And the saddest thing is that those around them often do not notice this hidden struggle, preferring to make superficial judgments. What follows is a consideration of 13 inconspicuous signs that may indicate that a person has experienced deep suffering. We will analyze why such people behave differently from others, sometimes even unconsciously. And, most importantly, we will suggest a path for transforming this quiet pain into awareness, choice, and, ultimately, healing. Some scars are not visible to the naked eye, but they exist nonetheless. They manifest in a person's appearance, in how long it takes them to start trusting others, in their desire to sometimes isolate themselves from the world, even when surrounded by people. Wounds that leave no visible traces shape a person's inner world, subtly changing their perception of reality. Old pain does not announce itself openly. It becomes a way of life, turning into silence where words should be spoken, into stiffness where openness once reigned. Sometimes a person even forgets that they carry this burden of the past. They simply feel constant fatigue, noticing that any task requires much more effort from them than from others. It seems to them that life, for some inexplicable reason, is always harder. According to the eminent psychologist Carl Jung, psychological trauma is a mental wound that, if ignored, continues to subtly poison a person's existence. However, he also argued that this painful wound can become a starting point for deep personal transformation. It is not about erasing the source of suffering from memory, but about transforming what continues to torment a person, like a constant threat. When pain finally finds its listener, it ceases to be a curse, turning into valuable awareness. Unfortunately, the ability to listen to one's pain is a skill that almost no one teaches. Modern society demands productivity from us above all else, not self-compassion. Therefore, those who have experienced deep suffering are forced to invent their own ways of surviving. They erect protective masks, resort to emotional patterns, and hide from the outside world. They continue to live, sometimes even with a smile on their face, but within them remains a state of constant readiness for danger, as if any touch could reopen a barely healed wound. Perhaps the reader recognizes themselves in the described traits, or perhaps they will better understand the behavior of a loved one. In any case, it is important not to analyze someone else's personality, but to show more empathy, provide support, and, most importantly, avoid guilt. After all, there is a story behind every action, and no character trait arises out of nowhere. In life, there are people who, from an early age, have learned a bitter lesson. Dependence is fraught, requests are painful, and hoping for others can turn into humiliation or rejection. In response, the psyche forms a defense mechanism, and the person becomes self-sufficient, strong, decisive, and unwavering, but emotionally exhausted. Carl Jung called this a false self, a structure created by the ego to survive in situations where showing one's true essence becomes too dangerous. This is a special way of functioning that on the one hand protects and on the other isolates. A person gets used to carrying all the burden alone, and those around them, unaware of the true state of affairs, begin to believe in their ability to cope with any difficulties. However, as we know, no one can constantly be strong and omnipotent. That is why the first distinguishing feature of people who have experienced a lot of suffering is the armor of hyper-independence. This is not a sign of maturity, but rather an old scar that may seem impressive from afar, but inside it is as heavy as lead. Such a person refuses to show their pain, although they feel it to the fullest. They do not ask for comfort, although they need it, simply because they have forgotten how to do it. Perhaps they are ashamed, or they do not even remember what it is like to trust without fear. This rigidity permeates all spheres of life: relationships, friendships, work. Everything turns into a performance, a constant self-control, for which one has to pay a high price. The chest tightens with tension, a touch feels like a threat, and rest seems like an unpardonable weakness. Even surrounded by people, one feels alone, because hyper-independence is not freedom, but a prison with an internal lock. People living with this don't want to be a burden to others. They only seek to protect themselves from repeating past traumas, but deep down it's just a way to stay quietly wounded. Another characteristic often found in people who have experienced excessive suffering is heightened empathy. At first glance, this quality may seem like an unconditional virtue, and in many situations it truly is. However, when empathy becomes a survival tool, it ceases to be just a character trait, becoming a life strategy. Some people, even in early childhood, develop the habit of scanning the surrounding space as if looking for shelter. They pick up on the slightest signs of impending danger, feeling the tension in the air, the tone of voice, a fleeting glance, sudden silence. Nothing escapes their attention. Developing acute sensitivity, they involuntarily begin to feel other people's emotions before they realize their own feelings. This excessive empathy does not arise out of nowhere. It is born out of acute necessity, out of fear of becoming a target for an unpredictable parent, out of a desire to anticipate the emotional outbursts of a mother. It is the burden of maintaining peace in the family, even at the cost of one's own childhood. The famous psychologist Carl Jung called projection the unconscious mechanism of transferring to others those qualities that a person is not yet ready to recognize in themselves. This is often what happens to those who are excessively empathetic to others. They subconsciously seek to heal the wounds of others that they could not cope with in themselves. Such a person becomes a constant support, an advisor, always ready to help. However, behind this outward selflessness lies deep exhaustion. Those who constantly feel the pain of others often forget about their own needs. Excessive empathy may seem like a noble quality, and sometimes it truly is, but it can also be a form of escape from oneself, a way to avoid delving into one's own suffering, an opportunity to live for others because existence for oneself has become an unbearable burden. Worse, such empathy can lead to an imbalance in relationships, where one constantly gives and the other only takes, where attention to other people's problems becomes an excuse for ignoring one's own. Gradually, this heightened sensitivity turns into emotional overload. People burdened with this trait often feel invisible when they are not benefiting others. This is a sure sign that empathy has ceased to be an expression of love, turning into a defense mechanism. At the heart of this emotional sensitivity lies a deep reason. Once it was necessary to anticipate other people's emotions in order to survive. But now this is not necessary, and perhaps the highest manifestation of true empathy will be to turn this attention inward to one's own needs and feelings. There are people who seem to love half-heartedly. This does not happen from a lack of feelings, but on the contrary, from their excess, forcing them to restrain themselves. They become observers, carefully analyzing every detail before opening their heart to another. Even when trust begins to sprout, they keep a certain part of themselves intact, protecting it from outsiders. This hidden part is always full of doubts, as if an inner voice constantly warns, "Be careful, because pain may return." And indeed, such a probability exists. For those who have been deeply wounded in the most vulnerable place, opening up to another becomes a difficult task. Memories of past rejection sound much louder than the timid manifestations of affection. Love knocks on their door, but fear relentlessly follows in its footsteps. This is one of the characteristics of those who have experienced too much suffering in the past. Fear of genuine intimacy. Intimacy triggers a mechanism of old anxieties, and this is not a manifestation of excessive drama, but rather an unconscious recognition of patterns of behavior that have left deep scars on the soul. Even if a person is unable to explain their reactions, behind them almost always hides an inner child who remembers how painful it was to trust and then be betrayed. Outwardly, such a person may seem self-confident, even self-sufficient. They may utter phrases like, "I don't need anyone," or "I'm better off alone." And however, inside them hides a deep longing, carefully buried beneath a mask of indifference. And every time someone tries to get too close, this longing breaks out, manifesting as fear, irritability, a desire for control, or withdrawal into silence. True relationships require complete dedication and presence in the moment. But for those who have experienced painful experiences, such openness seems like an unacceptable vulnerability. As a result, love turns into a battlefield, not a safe haven where you can find peace and support. If you love such a person, you will need immense patience and understanding. And if you recognize yourself in this description, you will need courage, not to recklessly rush headlong into the abyss, but to realize that the present may not be an automatic repetition of the past. Not all love hurts, and not every expression of attention hides rejection. Sometimes it's just a sincere desire to be there and support you. How often have you heard the phrase, "You are so strong"? And each time a smile, gratitude, and a nod follow in response. But no one realizes that the same night, the person is again drowning in tears of loneliness, falling asleep with pain in their heart. There are people who have become symbols of unwavering will, not because they aspired to this, but because they had no other choice. When life's storms break too early, you either have to hold the roof over your head alone or be buried under the rubble, and so the body, obeying the instinct of self-preservation, learns to get up every morning, even when the soul desperately wants only one thing: to disappear. One of the characteristic features of those who have experienced immeasurable suffering is the creation of an image of a strong person, who, nevertheless, is broken inside. Outwardly, composure, voice, full of confidence, gaze, firm and unwavering. However, behind this impeccable mask lies exhaustion, unknown to others. After all, showing fatigue seems like an unacceptable weakness, and demonstrating pain is completely out of the question. Carl Jung called this persona, a social mask that we all wear. But when the pain reaches unbearable proportions, this mask ceases to be a conscious choice, turning into an impenetrable shield behind which a person hides their true essence. The individual becomes what the world needs, forgetting about their own feelings and needs. The danger lies in the fact that seeming strength turns into a silent prison. No one offers help because everyone is convinced that the person is completely in control of the situation, but no one is able to constantly cope with everything alone. What looks like unwavering stability from the outside is often just carefully restrained chaos. What is taken for self-control is actually a panic fear of shattering into fragments in front of others. And life turns into an endless struggle to maintain the appearance of well-being while cracks grow inside. And when a breakdown occurs, it happens in solitude, in the depths of the soul, into a pillow, on the way home. No one notices, no one suspects, because the performance was played flawlessly. It doesn't even occur to anyone that something might be wrong. But it is not so. The burden turned out to be unbearable, and it had to be carried for too long. True strength lies not in never falling, but in the ability to admit, "Today I am having a hard time," and to believe that there will be someone who will listen without judgment, unsolicited advice or pressure. Just listen and understand. Perhaps at that moment the armor will begin to weaken, allowing the light of hope to penetrate the wounded soul. One of the distinguishing features of people who have experienced deep suffering is increased sensory sensitivity. Loud sounds fall on them like an avalanche, bright light causes irritation, and being in crowded places leads to complete exhaustion. Consciousness desperately tries to keep the situation under control, but the body reacts instantly and unmistakably. The heart begins to beat wildly, breathing becomes intermittent, and there is an unaccountable desire to immediately leave this place. It is important to understand that this is not a manifestation of excessive dramatization or a tendency to exaggeration, but only the result of the nervous system adapting to life in a state of constant heightened readiness. Behind this heightened sensitivity lies a whole story, memories of childhood, where danger arose suddenly and unpredictably, a traumatic experience that turned the surrounding world into a source of constant threat, and a body that for a long time did not have the opportunity to relax and feel safe. When emotional pain becomes deep and enduring, the body does not forget about it. As Jung said, everything that is not realized returns in the form of fate. In the case of chronic mental pain, it manifests itself through physical sensations. The body expresses what the soul has not yet found words for. This increased sensitivity allows a person to notice details that go unnoticed by others, a barely perceptible background noise that seems aggressive, a smell that is not felt by anyone but them, a gaze that lingered for a split second longer and is perceived as condemnation. It's like living with sensors constantly turned on, even when there's no real danger. This state is extremely exhausting and often leads to bewilderment from those around you, who don't understand why a particular place seemed strange, why a party was too crowded, or why a certain conversation left a person completely drained. However, for someone with this heightened sensitivity, everything is a stimulus, and every impact is felt with maximum force. It's worth noting that such sensitivity can become a gift if properly understood and used. Many people with this trait are distinguished by developed intuition, insight, and deep awareness. However, when this sensitivity is rooted in traumatic experiences, it turns into a heavy burden. The body becomes a battlefield where battles unfold against threats that the conscious mind has long forgotten, but the soul still holds in its memory. The healing process begins with recognizing how the experienced pain affects the physical state. It's important to realize that discomfort isn't a sign of weakness, but an echo of past experiences. An exaggerated reaction to certain stimuli may simply be an old cry for help, a plea to be heard. Not every discomfort is accidental. Often it's just the body saying, "This was once too hard for me, and now I'm just trying to protect you." Another characteristic trait of those who have experienced deep suffering is a compulsive need for control. This isn't a manifestation of authoritarianism or rigidity, but rather a desperate attempt to tame the chaos that once seemed all-consuming. The person has learned that loss of control is tantamount to disaster, and now control has become as vital to them as air. Life turns into a carefully planned sequence of steps where every outcome is foreseen and every action is triple-checked. It's not about power, but about a deep-seated fear of being caught off guard, of facing again the pain that has already cost too much. Outwardly, this may manifest as high efficiency, organization, and responsibility. But inside, a constant tension rages, giving no rest, even when everything is going well, the mind frantically looking for a catch. As Carl Jung astutely observed, the ego strives to control precisely what the unconscious doesn't want to confront. In this case, control becomes an impregnable barricade, protecting against the unpredictability of life and the feeling of helplessness that once overwhelmed and never fully released its grip. People caught in this control trap struggle to relax, loathe delegation, and have difficulty accepting surprises. Surprises for them aren't just inconveniences but emotional threats, shaking the psyche and disrupting not only routine. Often they don't even realize how tightly they hold on to this mechanism, but simply feel constantly tired, overwhelmed, and compelled to fix everything even when not asked. But everything comes at a price. Relationships become strained, even minor decisions seem disproportionately difficult, and the present moment is never enough because the mind is constantly racing ahead, trying to anticipate possible problems. At its core, this obsession with control isn't a sign of strength, but rather evidence of emotional pain that once made the person feel utterly powerless. Now they're trying to make up for lost ground. However, life, this wild and mysterious force, isn't controllable. It can only be lived, and that requires trust. Not blind trust, but a small yet possible openness, a belief that not everything needs to be controlled for things to work out. Healing comes not through an immediate abandonment of control, but through a gradual realization that it's possible to exist without fearing that the world will collapse. Letting go of control is like turning off the light in a room where a person is used to sleeping with bright lights on out of fear of the dark. At first, it causes anxiety, but over time it can bring much-needed relief and rest. However, relaxation isn't always associated with revitalization, company, or conversations. Genuine relief often comes in moments of tranquility when the external world ceases to make demands, exert pressure, and intrude on personal space. This is the seventh distinctive trait of people who have experienced deep suffering. Silence becomes their refuge. It's not about isolation dictated by contempt for others, but about a vital need for personal space, a respite, time to hear one's own breathing without being consumed by others' expectations. Silence turns into a fortress, a safe place, a kind of cocoon where the soul gets a chance to recover. To those accustomed to noise, movement, and constant communication, the desire for a secluded corner, a brief conversation, a light presence may seem strange. However, for those who have weathered internal storms, silence is not emptiness, but a process of restoration. Carl Jung recognized the symbolic significance of retreat, viewing it as a psychic process of death and rebirth. When external circumstances seem overwhelming, the soul retreats, as if protecting a wound from touch, not out of alienation but for survival. Silence is not merely the absence of sound, it is the absence of judgment, demands the need to wear masks. It is a space where nothing needs to be explained, where pain can simply exist without requiring an audience, without feeling the pressure of needing to heal quickly. However, over time, silence, initially serving as healing, can turn into a wall. What was once a respite becomes a persistent pattern of behavior, and there is a risk that silence will become associated with loneliness, and loneliness with oblivion. Therefore, this trait requires careful handling. Not always does the one who falls silent feel well. Sometimes people are just too tired to continue trying to fit into a world that never quiets down. It is important to allow oneself this silence without guilt, without the need to justify oneself, but at the same time, know when to open the door to let in someone who is ready to listen and stay close. Silence can be a home, but it must also have a door. Often a simple, "I trust you," may seem easy to say, but for those who have experienced the pain of betrayal, these words become immeasurably heavy. This gesture seems to get stuck in the throat, and emotions paralyze the whole body. It's not about the absence of feelings, but about the seemingly insurmountable risk. The eighth characteristic of people who have experienced deep suffering is the excessive protection of their heart, its confinement and guarding by all available means. This is not out of malice, pride, or indifference, but because the last time the heart was open, it experienced unbearable pain that penetrated the depths of the soul. The ego, seeking self-preservation, erects invisible filters, carefully evaluating everything before believing, doubting before surrendering, and analyzing gestures, tone of voice, and even the delay between messages. Love, before being accepted, undergoes the most severe testing. This is exhausting for both the one who feels and the one who tries to love, as attachment never comes easily. There is always a hidden burden, tension, and the question, can I really trust this person? The soul lives in a state of constant vigilance, as if someone is sleeping with one eye open. Jung spoke of the difference between a life dictated by fear and a life based on trust. In this case, fear becomes the lens through which a person perceives the world, relying on the memory of experienced pain. Even when everything seems fine, an inner voice whispers, "Be ready, everything can change." The subconscious seems unaware that time is passing and continues to react as if the threat still exists. Even when it is not so, even when a new person shows kindness, attention, and tenderness, distrust becomes a way to avoid repeated pain. However, such excessive protection ultimately blocks the opportunity to experience true love, as deep connection is impossible without a certain degree of surrender, without risk, and without willingness to open the door to one's inner world to someone. The irony is that those who most carefully guard their hearts tend to crave most to love and be loved. They just don't want to experience that pain again. They seek to protect themselves. But excessive protection also does harm. Perhaps the key lies in slow, gradual testing, in small displays of trust and observing how things develop. One needs to take a step forward, not opening up completely, but not running away either, because perhaps this time love has come not to cause pain, but to stay. A heightened sense of justice, like a sharpened blade, becomes a characteristic trait of those who have gone through the crucible of suffering. This moral compass, unerringly pointing to any falsehood, is born not from the dusty pages of books or pompous speeches, but from personal experience of encountering injustice, betrayal, and helplessness in the face of deep offense when no one offered a helping hand. A soul wounded by injustice acquires a unique ability to sense its approach from afar and is no longer willing to tolerate its manifestations. Even the slightest display of disrespect can trigger an old anxiety mechanism, reminding one of the past. Even when everything seems fine externally, the reaction to injustice manifests with a force determined not only by protection, but also by painful memories. As Jung astutely observed, emotional complexes are activated at moments when the present touches the unhealed wounds of the past. And an acute sense of justice is undoubtedly one of those wounds that has turned into a scar from being silenced, which now compels a person to refuse to be silent. Those around them sometimes do not understand this reaction, mistakenly taking it for exaggeration, dramatization, or impulsivity. However, in reality, it is the voice of the psyche firmly declaring, "This will not happen again. I will not allow myself to swallow this." This heightened ethical sensitivity often manifests itself early in life, in children who have witnessed injustice and felt their powerlessness, in teenagers rebelling against absurd rules, and in adults defending their beliefs with the same passion with which they seek to protect their inner child. The archetype of the moral fighter awakens in a person, zealously defending the principles of consistency, respect, and integrity, striving not for unattainable perfection, but for the preservation of dignity. This struggle, when balanced, takes on a noble character. However, if it is driven only by pain, it risks degenerating into rigidity and intolerance. The task is to preserve an acute sense of justice without allowing it to turn into armor that separates one from the world. It is important to be able to use the sword, but also to know when to lower it, when to listen to other people's opinions, when to show empathy. After all, those who have experienced the bitterness of injustice know better than anyone how much it hurts. That is why they are given a unique opportunity to do otherwise, becoming the force that protects without resorting to punishment, that fights without losing itself in the abyss of war. The bearers of the sword of justice possess knowledge inaccessible to many. Pain, like sandpaper, sharpens their perception, allowing them not only to unmistakably recognize injustice, but also to see what escapes general attention. Those who have suffered a lot develop a kind of radar that unmistakably picks up on other people's pain, even if it is artfully disguised by silence. Their eyes penetrate into the very soul, not through words, but through the ability to capture the unspoken. They unmistakably feel when someone is bad, even if a strained smile plays on their face. They understand what was not said aloud. They comprehend what no one has ever shared. Such people take their place in life without asking unnecessary questions, offering support and understanding with their mere presence. People who have gone through the crucible of suffering acquire an amazing ability to see the hidden in others, as if their feelings have been sharpened by pain. The soul becomes unusually receptive, catching the slightest signs of lurking sadness, even skillfully disguised. This is not magic, but echoes of past experience, when a person was in a similar situation and now recognizes it by barely noticeable manifestations. Such intuition is not acquired through training, it is born from personal experiences, awakened after falls and shocks. Those who have silently mourned their losses can hear the silence around them. Those who have felt lonely in a crowd unmistakably recognize a similar state in others. It happens almost instinctively. The famous psychologist Carl Jung argued that the integration of one's own pain allows us to better understand the collective pain of humanity. This is the essence of this trait, the presence of a kind of emotional radar which does not seek to demonstrate but comes to the rescue at the right moment. Often this is crucial. This sensitivity may seem fragile, but it carries a burden of responsibility, because seeing what others do not see is a serious task. Those who worry too much about others sometimes forget about themselves, absorbing other people's pain, showing care and participation, but at the same time losing themselves. The main thing here is to maintain a balance, to see others without losing one's own identity, to be there without dissolving into other people's problems, to feel together but not to take everything on one's shoulders. The ability to perceive the invisible is a valuable gift, but also a constant reminder of the need to take care of oneself. Pain, consciously experienced and worked through, becomes a tool that helps to support others without violating their personal space. In the fast-paced rhythm of modern life, people endowed with a special gift of empathy realize that the truth lies in the smallest details, in the posture of the interlocutor, in a fleeting hesitation between words, in the phrase, "I'm fine," which does not sound quite sincere. Only someone who has experienced deep emotional pain is able to recognize its echoes in others. However, this ability to see people through has its price. In the process of analyzing the views, gestures, and intonations of others, a disturbing thought creeps into the mind. What if, in the end, I myself turn out to be a burden to others? Many of us have probably noticed ourselves having a habit of apologizing for trifles or even for no reason at all. It feels as though the very presence, the fact of occupying a certain place in the lives of others, is already an unbearable burden. One of the characteristic traits of people who have experienced a lot of suffering is a deeply rooted fear of being a burden. This is a quiet but persistent feeling, a kind of unspoken shame for one's existence with all its needs, grievances, and desires. As a rule, people experiencing this fear rarely share it with others. However, it manifests in every attempt to adapt, to meet the expectations of those around them. In every "I'm fine," uttered only to avoid burdening others with their problems. In every stifled sigh and swallowed tear, so that no one suspects weakness. This fear often originates in early childhood, when a child's emotional pain was ignored or presented as a source of problems for those around them. Children who were told, "Stop crying," "Don't dramatize," or treated as if their feelings didn't matter, grow up with the conviction that experiencing emotions is a burden, and they themselves are a source of inconvenience. This concerns an adult who, despite their kindness, responsiveness, and responsibility, constantly experiences the fear of being too much. They are haunted by guilt for any request for help. They are embarrassed to show weakness, as if their very existence requires continuous compensation. Carl Jung called this unconscious guilt, a feeling stemming from a deep emotional wound around which the ego is formed. In this case, this wound instills, your value is determined by how little you bother others. Such a person gets used to constantly justifying themselves, striving to soften their own pain and minimize any needs. At times, even the manifestation of love causes them discomfort, as if they are taking the place of someone more worthy of that feeling. However, such a life is tantamount to walking on the earth filled with the fear of leaving a trace, existing with the feeling that even simple breathing requires someone's permission. The truth is that no one should feel guilty for their needs. Needing something is a natural human state. Fatigue and vulnerability are just as integral parts of human nature. Awareness of this fear is already a step towards healing. When the understanding comes that occupying one's place in this world is not a crime, but an inalienable right, something important happens. The burden becomes lighter, the soul straightens, and life ceases to be a continuous effort aimed at not bothering anyone. There is no need to deserve love, no need to excessively justify oneself. Simply being here is enough. Even under the oppressive fear of being a burden to others, the human soul finds peace in ordinary, often overlooked moments. In the soul-warming warmth of a morning cup of coffee, in a simple but sincere wish for a good morning, said by a loved one. People who have experienced heavy losses find the ability to see value in the smallest things, and it is in this that the beginning of healing lies. Warm ceramics in the palms, rays of the setting sun penetrating through the window glass, simple joys that fill life with meaning. A short message asking about a safe return home, the sound of rain outside the window while the world around continues to live its life. One of the distinctive features of people who have had to endure a lot of suffering is the ability to appreciate the little things. This is not elevating pain to a cult, but rather what remains after it is gone. In periods when it seems that the world is falling apart, when chaos takes over, simple things take on a completely new meaning. The small no longer seems insignificant. It becomes a symbol of life, peace, and the present moment. Those who have survived severe trials learn to see beauty where others simply pass by. A quiet gratitude is born in the soul not for the pain itself, but for what followed it, for the respite, for the unexpected affection, for the feeling of stability that once seemed unattainable. Carl Jung, an outstanding psychologist, in his writings touched upon the archetype of the sage, a person who, having gone through a collision with his own shadow, acquires a renewed vision of the world, characterized by greater humility, attentiveness, and conscious presence. It is this process of transformation that is observed in this case. A person does not need many external stimuli to experience deep feelings, and when they do experience them, they experience them to the fullest. This increased sensitivity is manifested in the smallest details. This is a person capable of sincerely smiling, watching the changing shades of the sky at sunset. They express sincere gratitude for a cup of coffee served at the right moment, or may cry under the influence of a melody that touched the strings of the soul, the existence of which they may not have suspected. Sometimes such sensitivity is mistaken for weakness, but in reality it is a manifestation of depth and emotional maturity. It is a quality of a person who has gone through chaos and retained tenderness. The ability to appreciate the simple joys of life is a distinguishing feature of someone who has known the bitterness of loss and now sees the true value of things while they are still around. It's a fuller presence in the moment, an ability to listen in silence and to express gratitude with a look even before a request is made. Another characteristic of people who have experienced severe suffering is the need to find a purpose after the pain. Simply surviving is not enough. The soul seeks to understand the meaning of what happened, to turn pain into a source of direction, to make sense of what once seemed like absolute emptiness. Often, after experiencing difficulties, a person begins to look for something greater than themselves, a reason to move forward, an assurance that everything experienced was not in vain. And this reason is rarely grandiose, but always deeply true. It could be helping those who are going through similar trials, creating something new, whether it's writing, caring, teaching, or healing. It could simply be supporting another person in a way that no one ever has. The main thing is having a purpose. Pain strives to become a path. Jung saw this as the beginning of the individuation process, when a person ceases to be a hostage of their own history and begins to transform it into awareness, purpose, and destiny. It's about the transformation of personality, when the inner essence comes to the fore, not external attributes. A person who has realized the finiteness of being and the value of every moment strives to fill their life with meaning, even if the past is overshadowed by suffering. The pain does not disappear. It remains a scar on the heart, but it ceases to be the defining force. Now it serves as a guide, pointing the way. Looking back, these people realize that despite all the difficulties, they continued to move forward, showing care and compassion. Without a clear plan, they managed to transform suffering into conscious presence, and presence into a meaningful purpose. It is important to note that this is not about creating a flawless image or demonstrating strength, but about a gradual transition from survival to a full life filled with intentions. The pursuit of a goal is not an escape from reality, but a natural stage of personal growth, marking the birth of something new in the soul. It is an inner voice that affirms, "I went through this, but it doesn't define me." It is from this moment that life begins to play with new colors. A person does not deny their pain, but neither does they allow it to consume them. In the very fact of survival lies an amazing strength, a kind of inner wisdom forged in the depths of the soul without unnecessary noise or applause. Each facet of the personality in question is nothing more than an imprint of the life path, evidence of the efforts made to maintain balance and move forward, even when internal forces strongly urge to stop. Some of these traits have become a reliable shield, protecting from adversity, others a faithful compass, pointing the direction, still others have turned into an unbearable burden, and others into a priceless gift. However, all of them, without exception, originated as a desperate attempt to protect something cherished that lies deep in the soul. As the insightful Jung said, "The tree that wants to reach the sky must have roots that reach down to hell." And in this lies a deep truth. Everything that the personality has turned into is inextricably linked to the trials it had to endure. There is no mistake in the fact that scars remain on its path. After all, it means that it is alive, and surviving, going through all the hardships, is already a feat. It is a manifestation of strength that is rarely found in the world, but which, nevertheless, exists, pulsates, and deserves recognition. It is not about claiming that all wounds are healed, and not about believing that everything will miraculously fall into place. Rather, it is about looking for the first time with more warmth and understanding at those parts of oneself that once evoked only hatred, realizing that they too, in their time, were trying to protect. There is no longer any need to hide or constantly be on guard. The sufferings that shaped the personality should no longer point the way. Now they can walk alongside in silence as a reminder of the past, continuing on its path with increased awareness, with greater freedom, and with an understanding that what once seemed like weakness was actually just a manifestation of an indomitable will to live. The personality continued to move forward, and that says a lot.